is welcome to talk. We'd love to have other people. I'm going to give a little bit of a history of my mother, and also I have a quote here from her autobiography, which is, well, actually it's a kind of vignettes from her life. Anyway, she was born in St. Louis in 1925, the youngest of three sisters. She lived in a very poor part of St. Louis, and one of the things, when she was 5 years old, she liked to tell the story of, she lived in a mixed, very poor black and white neighborhood, and she had a little friend called, little black friend girl called Josie May. So here is her story about what happened with her and Josie May. On this hot summer day, when Josie May and I went over to her house to play, her mother was busy at the ironing board. Who paid much attention to mothers? I don't remember too much about her mother. She seemed tall, at least to a 5-year-old, and slim and dressed in a wraparound house dress. I could smell the starch from the clothes she was ironing and the steam coming off the hot iron. We felt comfortable playing at the kitchen table, playing under the watchful eyes of Josie May's mother. We were playing with an old deck of cards and began squabbling over who should have first pick. As we had often done while playing together, we'd argue back and forth and eventually work it out, or go to a new game, or threaten to go our separate ways with an all right for you and get together on the next day. Our arguments never seemed serious and were part of the spice of being together and quickly forgotten. But not today, and not with Josie May's mother there to arbitrate. She put down her iron and with a stern voice, and to us scary voice, called Josie May over to her and told her to fetch a switch because she was going to whip her. I was in shock. In our house, I was rarely spanked, and never with a stick. Josie May tearfully brought her mother a stick, and her mother, with each application of the rod, said she was never, never, ever to argue with a white girl again. I went home feeling horrified, guilty, sad, and chastened. For how could we be friends again when I was the cause of a dreadful punishment and the embarrassment of seeing her being spanked in front of me? How she must hate me, I thought. It was only later as an adult that I realized that Josie May's mother was trying to protect her and keep her safe in the unequal world she lived in. But I also realized that being white was a cause for prejudice too. I wonder again, does Josie May ever think or remember me too? One of her early memories after that was of her father coming home bleeding profusely from the head. Her older sister, Ida, called the doctor. Her father owned a grocery store. He'd canceled his insurance a few days before and bought a gun. When somebody came in to rob him, he pulled out his gun and the robber shot him and fled. He survived, though. He was fine for many years. Her parents divorced when she was 12 years old. She was relieved since they fought all the time. In Detroit, she attended a high school of the arts, something like you see in Glee. She took dance, painting, and music, as well as clothing design. She attended Wayne State University for a while. When she was 18, she went to Los Angeles to stay with her aunt and cousin, and she managed to get a job of some sort in a movie studio. And last night I was reading about, I was reading her, parts of her biography, and at some point, and I don't know the exact time, she went to New York, even before she married my father, and she worked in a dress design shop. And in that dress design shop, there was a young model called Betty Bacall that she met. Betty later changed her name to Lauren, and it became Lauren Bacall. When she was 23 years old, she began taking fencing classes. She was one of the better fencers. Perhaps she first met my dad in a fencing duel. That would be appropriate since they were to spend their whole life fencing with each other. They got married in 1949 when she was 24 years old. After a year, they moved to New York and lived in what was called the Coldwater Flat. When they moved out, they met a young woman called Mary Travers who was looking for a place to live. She took over their flat. Mary Travers later became famous as part of the trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. In New York, Lee took dance lessons at Henry Street Playhouse and joined the Alvin Nicolai Company as a principal dancer. She also took lessons from Martha Graham. She continued as a dancer until I was born. After that, she taught dance, but no longer worked as a dancer. From there, they moved to a newly built co-op apartment on the Lower East Side. Although this was built with union and government money, it originally only rented to whites and Asians, not blacks. Originally, they lived on the 21st floor in a one-bedroom, and then moved to a two-bedroom on the 15th floor where my sister and I lived. And, Tracy here can tell you about that. She lived there many years. My mother was also very interested in politics. She took my sister and I door to door to work for Hubert Humphrey for president in New York in 1968. She and my father also took us to demonstrations for more money for schools. We also walked the picket line with the teachers during the first teachers' strike. Actually we broke the picket lines on the second teachers' strike because of some disagreement, which actually caused one of my friends not to talk with me for a while. She also began doing pottery in New York. She did some painting and sketching as well. In 1969, as astronauts were landing on the moon, my parents moved us to California in Foster City, where we had a big enough house for my sister and I to have our own rooms. Here my mother began teaching dance at the Beresford Recreation Center in San Mateo and taking pottery lessons there as well. When they built the Foster City Recreation Center, she moved her pottery there and gradually began running the weekend pottery workshops. In her spare time, she worked as a teacher's aide at Audubon Elementary School. After several years, she and my dad began to fight seriously. My dad found a counselor, and then my mom found a different counselor, and they began to going to marriage counseling. Eventually, they reconciled. And they were, as you know, they were married for 62 years. However, one of the counselors they worked with was so impressed with Lee that he hired her as a co-counselor, and she worked with him for a number of years until he died. He helped many people, became longtime friends with my mother even after they finished therapy. My parents continued to be involved in politics. They picked and elected a majority of the local school board. Later, when the developer for Foster City managed to elect 3 members of the city council to do his bidding, that is, lower his taxes and raise taxes on everybody else, they recalled the city council and elected their own slate to the council. This was more my father's doing, but my mother was quite involved with that as well. One thing I did not realize, that when my mother was running the pottery clinic and classes, she let people who could not afford the fees come without pay. Thank you, Karen, for telling me about that. That's something my mother never told me. My mother was a big fan of Jewish music. Although, as Golly said, she was not religious. We went many years to High Holy Days services mainly because of the music. My mother believed in education, but she was always skeptical of grades in school. My mother never concerned herself with my sister or my grades. My father was more traditional. My mother did not believe in TV, so my whole upbringing, I never had a TV until I left the house. And my parents didn't buy a TV until both Golly and I had moved out permanently. Every year in both California and New York, we would fly to Detroit for Passover to see my cousins and Lee's sisters, Ida and Alma, and my grandmother, her mother. She always loved all the cousins as well as the second generation cousins and all our family there. That was always a big thing for her, for Passover. And Melvin's father would always run the service. My mother was not a big fan of my first wife. Unfortunately, it took me a while to hear her. However, she has always been very loving to my current wife, Sue. When my son was born, my mother and father moved into our house and took care of Noah for the first month of his life, since my ex-wife was not supposed to wake up at night due to her illness. My mother loved my father very much. When he had a heart attack, she was devastated. When she broke her hip, he broke his hip soon afterwards and joined her in the hospital. She was overjoyed that he was with her. And they used to sit in their wheelchairs holding hands. In her last few years, my mother still cared about the world. Even though it was difficult for her to sign her name, she signed her name 2 times so she could vote for Obama for a second time. My parents were both overjoyed that they lived to see an African-American elected president. My parents moved to Foster City partly because the ads for Foster City showed young children of all races playing together. My mother wanted us to grow up in a diverse culture. When we were growing up in New York, on Saturday in the morning we would have bagels and lox. For dinner we would go out for Chinese food, followed by cannoli from an Italian restaurant. Although my mother was not religious, we would often get challah on Friday nights and light candles. And that's That's the story.